We are back after a short break. Mr. Wexler has replaced Ms. Olson.
A clear downgrade.
As counsel, as we question Mr. McCurdy. And now we're going to ask for questions from commissioners on this side of the dais. Commissioner Bayless, do you have questions?
I do. First of all, thank you very much for your testimony. I enjoyed that a lot. You mentioned twice, I believe, that the Texas regulators can inspect the facilities. Is it also provided that they can take samples during the inspection?
That is a good question, since I have not been involved with one of those processes up yet, just interviewed them and looked through their permits. I'm aware of the permit requirements saying that we can come in and inspect the facility at any time. I do not honestly recall if it says we can grab samples. However, there are requirements in all those permits, depending on the size of the discharge and the receiving body it's going into, as to what they require you to report on from an analytical standpoint, and how often they require you to report it. And all that information does have to come through an accredited lab.
Thank you.
Sir.
Okay, Commissioner Brankard.
Sorry, I think it's still empty. Anyway, I'll display my technical ignorance here right off the bat and ask you, what is highly polished produced water?
So we typically, currently through the peer-reviewed papers, through the research that's being done, we are aware of certain constituents that can pass through a distillation process. Typically, these tend to be the what we refer to as volatile organic compounds, such as ammonia, for one. Methanol would be another instance. Typically, these have vapor pressures lower than water. So before you get to the boiling point of water, they're going to flash off and go with the steam. So we have to come on the downside of that and pick different polishing process. Usually these are absorption processes that will strip those impurities out of that water. Once those impurities are out, then we refer to that as a highly polished water.
Thank you. Okay, so it involves cleaning the water, not making it shiny. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Let me just start then by talking about your direct testimony and this example you have of the hydrogen plant, diagram 1. And you say in your testimony that you're familiar with the proposed rule. Would this schematic meet the definition of an industrial project under this proposed rule?
Yes, sir, I believe it would. With one exception, as I mentioned, half the water in that project will be used for cooling. Typical cooling towers that use evaporative cooling, they flash off part of the water as steam. That remains starts to concentrate up. You can only do that so many cycles, and then you have to replace that water. In a typical industrial process, such as a refinery or a natural gas generation facility that has to have cooling, that water is released through a process called blowdown, so it goes to the environment. If the rulemaking said we do not want that water to be released to the environment through that process, we would have to keep it in a closed loop cycle and then take that water. And as I mentioned earlier, if it is considered, that water is still considered part of the oil and gas domain, we could take that back to a class 2 injection well or to be used in completions. Otherwise, that water would need to be disposed of via a class 1 well if it was considered an industrial waste.
Thank you. That's sort of the next question I have, because I would assume roughly that the numbers that are used on this chart would be the same if this was treated produced water rather than raw water?
Yes, sir. And I had an additional thought that just popped in my head right there. That water that would come off of that blowdown process would typically be, if it went in roughly 250 milligrams per liter, it's going to come off as 2,500, 3,000 milligrams per liter. We could just as easily reroute that to the front end of the hydrogen generation process.
So starting with this 59 kilogram raw water, and then you end up with 25 kilogram wastewater, that's about 40% or plus
Yep.
going into wastewater. And so I think you said this, but maybe you can repeat it. Where does this wastewater go?
So, and like I said, I appreciate you spurring my brain on to different directions. That water that would come off would basically be an RO permeate, or it would, or excuse me, a concentrate off the electrodialysis unit, electrodeionization unit. I always confuse those two words, and I'm trying my best. The concentrate off of either of those processes could be circulated back around because it would be lower TDS than the incoming produced water. We would mix it into that water, and then it would just repeat through that distillation process again and go through the electrodeionization unit. And any of those, what we would call a reject stream, would just be reverted back around to the front end where the raw produced water was coming in.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good because I was sort of doing very rough math in my head, which is very dangerous to have a lawyer doing math in his head with the numbers you gave and multiplying it by 365 and coming up with, 11 to 17 million barrels of wastewater a year from this facility. But you're saying a lot of this can be recycled.
And the reason I hadn't thought of that till now, because the diagram that I gave you was using RO, assuming you would use RO on the front end. Yeah. RO reject cannot be put back through an RO again because it's already going to be at its maximum level of treatment. So you would just be inefficiently wasting your time. But if you had a thermal process that could handle water up to 250 or 280,000 milligrams per liter, bringing an RO reject that was 30,000 milligrams per liter back around to that front end wouldn't hurt it at all. And that way you could keep it within the system and minimize those waste streams.
So I'm not sure I completely understood what Mr. Jacoby was testifying to earlier about waste streams. But if you took this wastewater to a disposal well, what class of disposal well would you take it to?
So as I just mentioned, if it was that water that had been polished, there would be some question at some point in time, and that's something that the regulations are going to have to address. You almost have to change the designation of the water. If it's an oil and gas waste, regardless of how it's been treated, and it gets handed off to an industrial process that's regulated by NMED, that's no longer an oil and gas waste. So you almost have to de-waste that water. If you do that, then that reject, if it couldn't be reused in the process, would have to go to a class 1 well. It could not go to a class 2 well. If it was still an oil and gas waste, then it could go into a class 2 well or be used in ongoing completions. If it was an industrial waste, that too could go to an oil and gas completion because there's not there's not a set requirement on the water that can come into a completion. You bring in water, if you brought in fresh water, that's not considered an oil and gas waste.
That's right. There's no, yes. So yes, okay. So thank you. I think now you seem to be on track with what I heard from Mr. Jacoby yesterday. That wastewater from these processes are now being sort of reclassified to such that they would have to go to a class 1 rather than a class 2 well, which obviously is a problem with this proposed regulation because it's telling people to send their waste to a class 2 well.
Right.
Okay. So
might I address that a little further?
Yeah.
Slightly. As I mentioned earlier this morning, the traditional way of treating a produced water and recovering a clean volume involved dropping out a lot of the divalent cations precipitating them out. Historically, that was a waste that had to go to a landfill. What we're trying to do now is pull some volume of low TDS water out of a produced brine. We're not altering that brine significantly. All it's doing is concentrating up. The discussions, and we have, as an industry, had discussions with EPA regarding that. EPA's consensus has been that as long as you're not substantially altering the ratio of the elements that are in that water, all you're doing is concentrating them up, that still classifies as a class 2 oil field waste. It does not become an industrial waste that would have to go to another form of treatment. That concentrated brine can still go down a class 2 injection well.
Okay, so that analysis would apply to treating produced water
Yes, sir.
as opposed to putting it through an industrial facility like
Right.
this hydrogen plant.
Now, again, we start to get into some questions here that have yet to be answered because it hasn't been done. When that produced water comes on the front end of that process and goes through that thermal distillation, and we take the relatively, excuse the term, fresh water, and we push it downstream to go through the electrodeionization, at what point in that process does that piece become no longer oil and gas waste? Does it now become an industrial water? Because then we have to treat everything separately downstream of that, unless we can reuse the waste stream back on the front end, because we can bring that industrial waste into that produced water stream and just push it through the process again, and it just becomes an endless loop.
So the other issue then, I think that also came to Mr. Jacoby's testimony, that when you transform this waste, you also lose certain exemptions, hazardous waste, correct? So if this wastewater had certain constituents concentrated to a level that it went above hazardous waste classification,
Yep.
now this wastewater, you have to deal with it as hazardous waste, correct?
So in certain instances, you're absolutely correct. But if we come through this distillation process and we come through a polishing step behind it, which we would have to, because we have to get very clean water over to this electrodeionization unit. Once we go through there, there's not going to be any hazardous ingredients kick over to that unit. So the waste stream's not going to have it. I heard a public testimony with a lot of concern over the potential for radium to carry through these distillation processes. As I demonstrated, and I believe it was the Pennsylvania example of the treatment plant up at Wysox, PA, and the requirements by the Commonwealth on what they would allow for water to be considered for discharge. Radium has to be below 5 picocuries per liter in order to discharge, thus those treatment processes in place. And I'm very familiar with Marcellus water, and there is fair amounts of radium in that water, much higher than most other basins in the U.S., and it is being removed through those treatment processes.
Right. Yes, you could have a separate process just to deal with particular contaminant that's triggering them.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Actually, I've had to deal with this with our refineries in New Mexico who were triggering hazardous waste levels and had to spend a lot of money. In that case, it was selenium, just to get selenium out there.
Yes, sir. That in my previous career with Chesapeake Energy, Chesapeake was one of the largest operators in the Barnett Shale in North Texas. That particular brine has a fair amount of barium in it. It's not a problem down hole when barium has a higher solubility at temperature. As you produce that water up hole and into receiving tanks, the temperature drops, barium comes out of solution. Anytime barium comes out of solution, if there's radium in that water, it comes with it. So yes, we spent some money cleaning up tank bottoms and sending that off to approved low-level radioactive disposal sites.
Just to follow up on Commissioner Thompson's questions about scale, I believe you talked about these pilot demonstration projects somewhere in the range of 20 to 1,000 or so barrels per day.
Yes, sir.
So what I read from this material here, this hydrogen plant is 75,000 to 120,000 barrels per day.
Yes, that would not be a demonstration plant. That would be a full-blown plant.
But they're at this point in the proposed rule, they're both in there as categories. So
Yes, and to be perfectly transparent, I'm not aware of any produced water treatment facilities that size currently in operation, particularly in the US. Worldwide, we have some desalinization, seawater desalinization facilities that are that size. Within the US, the largest treatment plant we had was the Antero Resources plant in West Virginia, which is currently not operational.
just let me just quick touch on your rebuttal testimony here. Your first topic was dealing with the contention that there's no way of knowing what contaminants may be in produced water. I'm just curious, as a water company, you receive produced water from operators who are drilling wells, and they ask you to go do something with it.
Yes, sir. And by and large, what we do with it now is one of two things. We treat it to a spec where it's suitable for reuse in ongoing hydraulic fracturing, or we put it down a class 2 disposal well.
Now, when you get produced water from an operator, does that operator give you a list of the chemicals that have been added to that water in the drilling process?
No, sir.
So you don't know what you're getting.
No, sir. By and large, we don't. We typically have certain parameters that we require that water meet, meaning it can't contain hydrogen sulfide, dissolved hydrogen sulfide greater than 5 milligrams per liter. It has to have a certain level of bacteria activity below a certain level. And typically that's the only parameters that we ask for, because the purpose of what we're doing now, the constituents in it would not affect that in any.
And I assume you're aware under the New Mexico Produced Water Act that it specifically states that when an operator transfers produced water to somebody else, the transferee is now responsible for that produced water.
Yes, sir.
And so your response then to that contention is that there are ways of figuring it out, basically, what's in the water. You don't need a list. You can do enough different kinds of testing to that water to figure out what's in there.
Yes, and to be clear, I do not believe I've stated that we're there yet, that we still believe there may be a few unknowns, and that's what the current analysis has indicated. Currently, there's no peer-reviewed papers that reflect that number, because this research is just recently being completed, and that research is in the initial peer review phase. But the research that we've seen over the years, particularly if we go back to Dr. Danforth's paper, said there could be potentially this many unknowns. And as a research, and there are peer review papers out there that reflect this, says now we believe there's this many, we've looked at this water and we think it had this many in it. So we're narrowing that list down. I'm confident, personally, that we are going to get to the point, hopefully in the very near future, to where we understand exactly what's in that treated water.
Okay, so Dr. Balch's testimony states this, and it's also in one of the exhibits that you provided. I believe it's Exhibit 79. It says that pretty much most of the flowback water that's coming from drilling and completion chemicals, that will be pretty much done in the first 30 days after the well is completed. Do you agree with that?
That generally, yes. And the reason I respond that way is flowback is looked at operators in different basins in different ways. Generally speaking, by and large, industry is not of the contention that flowback fluid is not a produced water. Flowback is a process. Some companies, if you're in the Haynesville Shale, the flowback process ends the minute you start getting deliverable gas out of the well. Some areas, they dictate a time period. If you just mentioned that the first 30 days are flowback, some people may look at the TDS content of the water and say, when we hit this level, we believe we've got through the flowback process and we're in there. This was in the early days, particularly of the unconventional production, where everybody was completing wells with fresh water. That's where we saw a pretty dramatic swing over a temporal period in the constituents in the water, because initially the flowback would be relatively fresh. And as more and more naturally occurring, or not naturally occurring, but naturally present produced water was mixed in, we saw that come up. Particularly here in the Permian Basin, with the abundance of reuse that we see nowadays, that initial production, if you want to refer to it as flowback, is not significantly different than the overall production long-term in the well, because we're taking the water out of other wells and putting them down this new one. So you immediately see that same quality water come back.
Okay. Dr. Balch used the sort of the idea that when you stop seeing much sand in the water, then you know you're past the flow back.
That is true. We had a lot of issues with sand initially up front. There's been a lot of work done to help alleviate that. A lot of people go in with a different size sand at the very tail end of the stage. Some people, depending on what area you're in, will use like a ceramic sand that'll interlock to prevent that other sand from coming out. But yes, up front, particularly years ago, we saw a lot of sand come back during that initial period.
So my question is, would it make sense? Would it make treatment of produced water simpler? Would it make analysis of treated produced water simpler? Would it make the regulator's life simpler if we simply just didn't allow treatment of produced water from the first 30, 60, 90 days of production? And just said that water has to go to a disposal well.
That's a good question. And I'm not sure how I can answer that on a couple of different avenues. Number one, depending on how the well was completed and how it's brought on. If it's brought on through flowback equipment, which is generally designed to capture any sand coming out, then it could be diverted off to another use. Some operators bring those wells on and bring them straight into their existing surface equipment, which means they automatically become mixed with their other produced water, and it would be hard to segregate that water.
In other words, it's complicated.
It's complicated. By and large, the completions that we see in the unconventional world today, I'm not going to say they're benign, but they're relatively low in different chemical constituents. Typically, we see either a friction reducer or a high viscosity friction reducer, which are some variant of a polyacrylamide. We'll see a scale inhibitor in the water, and typically we'll see some sort of a biological control.
Right.
As a biocide, most commonly nowadays, everybody are using processes that are oxidative biocides, so they become relatively immune fairly quickly. Chlorine dioxide, for example. Chlorine dioxide is used in, I believe, 19% of the municipal water treatment plants in the U.S. Peracetic acid's another one. Both of those rapidly decompose in the water. So people have steered away since maybe 20 years ago, when we were looking at more biocides like glutaraldehyde, which they have a longer life and things of that nature. And we've moved over to these oxidative biocides. Typically, that's unless you're going in with a gel at the very tail end, where you have to put guar and some other additives. That's the only additives that you see in most of these completions.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
Commissioner Behill, any questions?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Going to the platform, Commissioner McWilliams, do you have any questions? Or Commissioner Rosatos, do you have any questions?
No, Madam Hearing Officer, no questions for me. Thank you.
All right.
I have questions. Sorry, sometimes the platform allows me to unmute myself and sometimes it doesn't.
All right. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Yesterday we heard testimony from Dr. Vengosh, who stated he believes the rule should have more specificity to it and have specific standards included in the rule. What is your position on that? Do you think that this version of the rule should add those standards?
So I believe that there could be a certain set of standards. I don't know that you're in a position right now to set discharge standards for this treated water, but you could allow a set of standards that would allow continued research in this water along with field projects and pilots. I agree with the statement that we need to continue the data analysis and taking a look at these technologies. And I think ultimately it's going to be a two-step process. It's going to be a process that sets some guardrails for this process to move forward, leading ultimately to a set of standards that would address discharge to uh, land or possibly discharge to the surface water.
Okay, but at this point, do you think we need to include in the rule a way to be able to discharge, as a demonstration project or as a pilot project as part of this data collection process?
Yes, Commissioner, the purpose of my testimony here is to say that NMOGA is opposed to setting a band in place that would simply say we're not going to go forward with doing this and we're not going to allow this. We would have to have some sort of rulemaking in place, particularly for small scale pilot projects. We do want to be protective of the environment, and we want to do it in such a way that we can gather the essential data without doing any harm to the environment. So there would need to be some sort of regulation in place. If we were looking at a small scale land application, not saying you duplicate Texas. And I hope throughout all of my testimony, I've not made an indication that you need to follow what Texas is doing. I've just given them up as an example. But they have set standards regarding monitoring and analysis in place that if you're going to do this project, this is what you're going to do, and you're going to report this data back to us. And they are specifying what analytes to be analyzed for, how often to do it, where, if we're talking soil, within a plot, where to grab the samples from and how deep. Those kind of standards will need to be developed for these pilot projects.
Understood. As compared to New Mexico, I think you mentioned that New Mexico is ahead of Texas and Colorado in terms of the produced water consortium and these reuse rules, but it sounds like Texas is sort of leapfrog New Mexico in allowing these pilot projects. Do you agree with that?
I would believe I would have to agree with that, the way it was worded.
Do you know what conditions are required that is allowing Texas to discharge into the Pecos River?
So I am aware that TCQ has a set type of analysis that they are looking at. It's also my understanding that they are looking at this expanded list that the New Mexico Research Consortium has developed. Looking at that, so they would have to do the analysis for that full suite of analytes as well. So it's not just. I hope I'm not oversimplifying the process, saying that you're going to give us data on 20 different constituents and we're going to allow you to discharge. That is not the case. They were taking a much more extensive approach to this.
And is the Permian water similar in nature, or is there any reason New Mexico wouldn't consider something similar?
If we're talking particularly the lower or the northern Delaware Basin, so right at the state line, that by and large is also Wolfcamp completions. So that's going to be no different than those Wolfcamp completions south of the state line. The little rusty barbed wire fence isn't going to change that anyway. A little bit further northern in the Delaware, you get into Avalon Bone Springs completions. They tend to be a little bit lower TDS, but not much than the Wolfcamp. So essentially, yes, the water is not that significantly different between the two areas.
Okay, thank you. In your role on the Produced Water Consortium, do you think it's the role of the Produced Water Consortium, whether we're talking about Texas or New Mexico, to provide the database of experience to the environmental department?
Yes, I think that's exactly what those consortiums are there to provide for. They're there to generate data that will be significant to the regulators in each state as they move forward with this potential beneficial use of produced water. Several of the universities in both states are doing relevant research in this area, and a lot of it is being funneled up through the consortia in each state, and that's what their role is. The role is to provide this data, provide this to the regulatory bodies in each state so that they can make informed decisions.
And in the last 4 or 5 years that the New Mexico Produced Water Consortium has been in its existence, is it your opinion that they have done this and that they're doing a good job at doing this data collecting and providing it to the environmental department?
It is my opinion that yes, they are. It is. I will say that it can be a time. What I'm looking for. It takes time to get this done. When you're looking at pilot projects, you go through a process to where you put out an RFP for companies that have technologies to see if they want to apply. It takes a certain amount of time for those responses to come in. Then you need a committee to go through those responses and determine which ones you feel worthy of providing money to for analytical work and that thing. So by this time, we're now through a year. Now we have to run those pilot projects. Unfortunately, and you may find this hard to believe, but pilots don't always come off as planned. Sometimes you think it's going to start in April and you end up starting the pilot in July. So that ends up with delays. By the time you gather all the data and it is sampled in a defensible format, taken into an accredited lab, and the data gets back and you assimilate it, you're now almost 2 years into the process. So now you've got the research. You use that research to build a paper that's going to go out for peer review. Not uncommon for that to take another year. So now we're into a 3-year process and we're starting to see papers come out that are pointing us in a positive direction. Now, from a consortium standpoint, and as I've heard addressed here today, the peer reviewed papers are extremely important and we need that data. But when we're in the research process and we're getting that information back, the consortia is able to start making decisions then. This was a very positive treatment technology. This one was promising, but it needs something extra on the end. And we provide that feedback back to the technology providers. Your process looked great. These numbers look great. You have a problem with ammonia. You need to figure out a way to fix that. So in answer to your question, and I realize I went a little long there, but yes, I do believe the consortia is generating information and data that will help, in New Mexico's case, will help the Environment Department make decisions. And that data is available. These are public consortia. So if you go out to the consortia's website, any of the data through these pilot projects have been generated is available there on that website, as well as to the consortium members.
So do you feel like we have enough of the data in this consortium and released in the environmental to be where we can make these rules today? And also, well, let me just ask that question first.
So if I back up to the statement I made about possibly setting guardrails for these pilot projects, yes, I do believe that we have the data available now to help with setting up those guardrails to allow small scale pilot projects to move forward. Do I believe we're in a position to where we could write a permit for discharge tomorrow? Probably not. We need these pilot projects and continued research work to eventually close this gap to where we can be in that position. Again, I'll reiterate of my own personal opinion that I don't believe we're far off from doing that.
Okay, so you're saying we need to allow these pilot projects to discharge at very small scale, and we're ready for that stage of a project right now, but we're not at the stage for full scale discharge.
That is correct. I would prefer it be like a small scale land application if that's what it was, because this would be something that would be controllable and monitorable, excuse me. I would not be in favor of a small scale project that discharged to a waterway at this point, because it would be harder to monitor that and gather data off of it. That will be something for a little bit later in the process.
And then one final question is related to the public, I guess, being informed of the research, in terms of getting the environmental department to approve discharge, whether it's on a pilot scale basis. or a full-scale discharge basis, how do we balance the proprietary nature of those treatments with the public needs to feel informed and feel like it's being monitored appropriately?
Okay, and I'd like to make a distinction between the proprietary nature of the technology as opposed to the proprietary nature of any chemicals or constituents that might be in the water. I think the data that's produced, particularly from a defensible data standpoint through an accredited lab, I believe that data should be fully available for the public to review. Any water that would be proposed to be discharged to land in any of these, the public should have access to that. As technology providers are developing this technology, there are advancements being made where intellectual property needs to be protected in that instance. There are ways we can generically describe what the process does without revealing IP, and that would be the proprietary nature that would need to be protected. Not in any way to hide it from the public, but in a way to protect a technology provider's investment in their intellectual property to ensure that their competitors were not able to just swoop up their ideas and take them for their own. But with regards to the data and the quality of the water, that should not be, that in no way should be a protected, that should be available to the public at large.
Okay, thank you. That is all of my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner McWilliams. We'll turn then to questioning from the parties. Mr. Maxwell, do you have questions of Mr. McCurdy? If you were talking, I didn't hear anything, Mr. Maxwell. I believe you're muted. Mr. Maxwell, you're still muted. You can unmute yourself. Perhaps put something in the chat. Did you send him an invite to unmute? Yes, I did send him. Well, I see a red microphone. Is there anything in the chat? All right, so Mr. Maxwell will try to rejoin. No, see, we're seeing a red microphone, Mr. Maxwell, on your. You just make sure. I did. You did. Yeah, I didn't have a lock, but I did anyway. You sent him a message. I believe he's logged off. All right. It's raining out there.
Testing. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, now we can. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. My apologies. That was difficult. It didn't show me muted. Your Honor, I have no questions for Mr. McCurdy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Maxwell. Let's see, Ms. Taylor. All righty. Uh, very regularly in their city, and so all right. I would suggest to you that the rulemaking rules are fairly uh, generous, at least the ones as we've drafted them in New Mexico. But Ms. Taylor, do you have a response?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Mr. McCurdy is appearing on behalf of NMOGA, not on behalf of Select. And so I am questioning him in his role as a representative of NMOGA.
All right. Objections overruled. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. McCurdy. I'm Liz Taylor, and I represent Select. I'm happy to meet you in person for the first time today. First question I did want to ask is, does concern your employment by Select. Do you think that employment would affect or bias your testimony?
No, ma'am, it wouldn't.
Why not?
Number one, I've been in the oil and gas industry for 44 years now. For the last 15 plus, I've been a strong advocate for the use of produced water within the oil field to replace fresh water use. And then very strongly in the last 5 to 8 years and looking at the potential beneficial use. That was long before my time of employment with Select Water Solutions. So my opinions expressed here today are based a lot on my past history and the things that I've done within the industry. And I'm not here today making those assumptions or based strictly on my employment with Select Water Solutions.
Do you think the use of produced water has broader benefits than just to Select?
Oh, absolutely. It's the New Mexico Consortium has an untold number of industrial participants, as does the Texas Consortium, as does the Colorado Consortium, from operators as well as midstream companies, as well as technology providers. So there's a lot of people interested in this space. Select's definitely not the only one. Select happens to be the largest produced water recycler in the U.S., but that has nothing to do with the potential to beneficially reuse the treated produced water.
I want to just tie up something that Commissioner Brankard was talking about to you about the concentrations of the contaminants in the reject water. Does that relate to the RCRA exemption we talked about a little bit yesterday? Could you explain that?
Yes. So I was here for that discussion yesterday afternoon, or I believe I was here when that came up. That has long time been a concern. This was something back in the early 2010s, NGOs really pushed EPA hard on that the flowback water was different than produced water. Therefore, flowback water was not entitled to that ENP exemption from the RCRA subcategory C hazardous waste regulations. It was the ultimate determination of the Environmental Protection Agency that flowback water was just a part of the production water as a whole and was entitled to that protection. Now, since then, my position has been is I work with the consortia when I look at different technologies, and you can talk to the consortium members because I have brought this up in every one of the membership meetings. When we look at technologies, we need to be sure and we keep an eye on what we are doing with this water. If we, as I stated earlier, we change it significantly in a manner that it could possibly no longer be considered a produced water, then it will be potentially, depending on the constituents in it, it will be potentially considered a hazardous waste. And the disposal expense of a hazardous waste is exponentially higher than that for a produced water.
So let's move on to another topic. the frac focus, which is the database of frac water. And there's been some concern about the use of trade secrets or proprietary redactions in that database. I'd like you to talk a little bit about trade secrets and proprietary information. Are those substances always hazardous?
No, not necessarily. There's many reasons that a chemical manufacturer can go to OSHA and ask for that trade secret exemption. And it may not have anything to do with the hazardous nature of the product. It may be that they have found a unique application for a non-hazardous product. And again, they're trying to protect that from their competitors. So they're asking to keep the name of that ingredient classified. OSHA knows what that ingredient is. The process is you take a safety data sheet that contains every ingredient as listed, along with an identical one that reflects what you're asking for a trade secret process, and you take that to OSHA. OSHA has to look at it and they have to approve that application and allow you to use that trade secret process. Within the rules and regulations, you cannot subvent if that product that you're asking for trade secret is a carcinogen and it is in there at a certain level. Though you don't name it, you have to put that health information on that safety data sheet. If that ingredient causes that product to have a level of contaminant that is above what's immediately dangerous to life and health, that information has to be in that safety data sheet. You're allowed to keep the name out, but you're not allowed to hide any dangers that are associated with that product. Another thing that I would like to apply, and I understand this is important to us because we're talking about potentially treating produced water and putting it out, but those regulations weren't developed for hydraulic fracturing. That is developed for all industrial chemical processes within the United States. There are waters and trucks that are transported through there are products and trucks that are moved through rail cars and trucks every day. Cities in the U.S. that have trade secret ingredients that have nothing to do with the oil and gas industry. I don't have a problem with doing away with those regulations, but that is something that's going to need to happen at a level. States can have some effect on that. If I remember correctly, Wyoming was the first state to say we will allow no trade secret products listed in frac focus for wells completed in this state. What happens then is typically it's the newer products, the newer chemicals that will be being developed that they want trade secret identification put on some of the ingredients. Those products simply don't go to Wyoming. They go elsewhere.
If a product in frac focus is hazardous, can people find out what that particular product is?
There is a method within the regulations, and if I remember correctly, this is Federal Regulate 40 CFR 1920.1200 that will go in. It tells you how you go about collecting a trade secret application, but then there's language in there that says if a doctor is treating an individual that has been suspected to be exposed to this chemical and it is something listed as a trade secret in it, that doctor can ask for that information from that manufacturer. The manufacturer is required to supply that information, provided that doctor signs a confidentiality agreement within 48 hours. Likewise, an industrial hygienist who is looking at a group of people that may have been affected by that particular chemical can ask for that information. The company can say they're not going to give it to them. Then that goes before OSHA to determine if fines are in place for not revealing that information. Otherwise, they ask that industrial hygienist to sign a confidentiality agreement or a non-disclosure agreement, and they provide that information.
So moving on to the consortium exactly in New Mexico. Are environmental groups members of the consortium?
Yes, they are.
And were you a member of the consortium before you became employed by Select?
Yes, actually, when this consortium was stood up in the fall of 2019, I was an independent consultant. I had my own consulting firm. I had left Chesapeake in June of 2019 and had set up my consulting firm in August. I believe the consortium was officially announced in September of that year. So that's when I had discussions and agreed to join as a consultant because I thought it was an important process. I wanted to be a part of it moving forward. I did not become a select employee until the November of 2021.
And just moving on, have you seen results of testing of the purity of the distilled water from treating produced water?
Yes, as I discussed just previously a while ago, that we're seeing good results come out of the New Mexico Consortium. Particularly, Texas is just now starting to analyze water from pilot projects in Texas, so I've not seen those results yet. Seen good results in New Mexico, as well as I've seen very favorable results in the peer-reviewed papers, such as I submitted as NMOGA Exhibit 75 through 127.
And I think you've done this a little bit, but could you describe how pure the water is that can be produced?
So generally speaking, we are getting it down to what would be considered a fresh status, which typically by rule or regulation is below 1,000 milligrams per liter. But in many instances, we're seeing results that are down in the 200 to 500 milligram per liter range on a total dissolved solids standpoint. Total dissolved solids.
And do you know what typical river water, what the TDS in typical river water is? Good river water.
Good river water is typically in that range, somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 milligrams per liter.
And then we've heard from comments from the public in this hearing and elsewhere that some people in the public are afraid of produced water. And can you explain the difference between raw produced water and treated produced water?
Absolutely. Number one constituent in raw produced water is salt. Okay? That is the number one constituent by and large. We oftentimes in this hearing, you've heard the produced water referred to as hypersaline produced water. Oftentimes, many times more saline than seawater. Seawater, I believe, was quoted and is normally 35,000 TDS, whereas produced water can vary from 7,000 to up close to 400,000 milligrams per liter TDS. So salt's the number one constituent. It will also contain significant amount of divalent cations, metals, organic, dissolved organics from being exposed to the oil in the formation over years or being exposed to the gas. All of those are going to be a problem for discharge, particularly salt, the salt alone. If I had a pure water that had 150,000 milligrams per liter of salt water in it, or pure salt, I couldn't discharge it anywhere. It would be harmful to vertebrae, it'd be harmful to fish, it'd be harmful to animals, and it would kill plants. So you would have to take salt out of that water or pull water out of that salt mixture. It's no different with produced water. We are trying to extract a level of clean water out of a complex brine, much more complex than just a pure salt water.
And there are other constituents too, other heavy metals and other things. And,
Yes.
and those are removed as well when you treat it.
Yes, that I understand the concern from the public. I would be too, that if I thought that radium or uranium were passing through, whether radium 226 or 228 was passing through, I would be very concerned about discharging that water. But if you take a look at the analysis and you take a look at the pretreatment, distillate, and polishing steps, we see that those radionuclides do not pass through that process.
And the other heavy metals and other constituents.
That's correct.
We've also heard concerns about PFAS in produced water. Do you have some ideas about the source of PFAS in produced water?
So historically, particularly back in the early 1980s, there was a trend where perfluorinated surfactants were used particularly in hydraulic fracturing fluids and gas well completions because they tend to let the well unload the water quicker. That trend kind of died away by 1990. Very seldom are they used today. I still believe if you search frac focus, you may find some rare instances fluorinated compounds being applied, but by and large, not so much. Another source that we see, there are areas to where industry pulls out of surface water, whether it be from a stream bed, pond, river. We see PFAS coming into the process through that. So that is another area where PFAS can get into oil and gas operations.
Would you say, just generally speaking, that PFAS comes more from source water or from what people put into the frack water?
The wells that are being completed today that we are seeing PFAS contamination in, I would be more inclined to say that came in through the source water itself. If that source water was, well, it's a mixed bag there. If it was produced water and eventually this water was treated with something that contained it, it just, as we're aware, it just keeps cycling through the process.
So I don't know that you completed your sentence here, but so would PFAS in the produced water now have an original origin, if I can use that term, in source water today?
It's a combination of the things, Ms. Taylor. Some of it could have come from the earlier use of chemicals, but then again, the PFAS generating compounds were much more abundant through other uses outside of the oil and gas organization than what chemicals have been used inside of the oil and gas organization.
And then just following up on one of the questions from Commissioner Dominguez, you talked about barriers to pilot projects. What did you mean by a barrier to continued investment in pilot projects in New Mexico?
So particularly if we put a ban in place or we make it significantly difficult to look at these small scale pilot projects, particularly for land discharge, to where we can determine how this water might affect some sort of agriculture or some sort of plant and growing, it just makes it difficult for us because there's no way you can do that in a closed loop environment, or it gets very expensive. You can go out and take an abandoned impoundment that's lined, truck in 3 foot of dirt and do it there to where it's all contained. But now you have the expense of bringing that dirt in, and eventually you're going to have to close that impoundment. So you're going to have to do something with that as well. The point I was trying to make with that barrier is, if it was me and I was investing money and I'm saying this is how it's going to be done in New Mexico, and again, I'm not trying to pit the two states against each other. I'm just making what would hopefully be a common sense argument that if I say Texas will allow me to do it this way and New Mexico says it has to be done this way, then I'm going to go over here and run that pilot.
I don't think the court reporter can say.
Oh, sorry.
So if the
bar in Texas was much lower than what it is in New Mexico for performing that pilot, then we would likely move the pilot opportunity over to Texas.
I think the proposed rule also has a general ban on any discharge ever.
Yep.
Correct?
Yep.
What's the impact of that ban as proposed in the rule?
So today, no impact. But if I've got the data available tomorrow that says we can safely do this, now we're looking at a year plus, maybe 2 years before we would have that opportunity here, because it's going to take some amount of time to go in and repeal that ban.
So do you think that would chill investment in New Mexico if the ban remains?
Most likely, yes.
All right, thank you. I have no other questions.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor. Commissioner Chair Thompson has a clarifying question.
One question to clarify. Proprietary chemicals have to be reported to Frac Focus.
Yes.
And the composition of those chemicals is secret. But if someone requests, can they get the safety data sheet?
Yes, they can. And let me clarify that. To my knowledge, no one claims a proprietary nature for the name of a particular chemical, but that chemical will have a set of constituents, and perhaps one of those constituents they will claim a trade secret process. Everyone has a right. If we have a product called A1 and it has a list of constituents, and one of those is trade secret, the public included has a right to reach out to that company and say, I would like to have that safety data sheet for product A1.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Cox, do you have questions of this witness?
No questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Mr. Hightower.
I really only have one question,
Yes, sir.
Rick. In the current regulations, the way they're proposed, there's a discussion of pilot projects, bench scale projects, and demonstration projects. And in your discussions with Chairman Thompson, there was somewhat of a disconnect. Would it be appropriate within the regulations to maybe put some definitions quantity-wise to help address those maybe differences in what people think are pilot, demonstration, bench?
Yes, I would agree with that statement, Mr. Hightower. Obviously, from the chairman and my discussion at that point, we were describing identical processes, but calling them two different things.
Correct.
And so I do believe it would benefit if there were definitions that said, this is what is considered a bench scale project. This is what's considered a pilot project. This was what be considered a demonstration project.
While you have the chance, would you like to make a recommendation on maybe a range for the commission?
So typically speaking, I believe if I take a look at most of these projects I've looked in the past, bench scale would generally be something in the neighborhood of, let's say, less than 5 barrels capacity per day. Most of them tend to be in the multiple liters per day type thing, but let's say less than 5. Pilot projects most likely are less than 50 barrels of production per day. And then a demonstration scale project would be typically less than 1,000 barrels of production per day. And that is a produced distillate that would be committed.
So you're talking about produced distillates. So if you're doing 50% recovery, so you would multiply that by 2
Yes.
for the amount of produced water.
Yes, sir.
So in the consortiums, the projects that we've had a couple of projects at Bergendorf that were 20 barrels a day. Those would be considered, in your opinion, not bench, but pilot, small pilots, or?
Well, so I've suggested a range, and perhaps we might need to discuss that
Okay.
range to better define it.
Okay,
before we,
all right. So that we've had some in the field through the notice of intent, through NMED, a number of companies. One company had a project that was 500 barrels a day. Another company had a project that was 100 barrels a day. Would those be classified as demonstrations for you, or would those be classified as pilot projects?
So,
Or which?
so we may need to bump up that pilot project because, in my opinion, and understand now that we've agreed on the definition of demonstration scale project, in my opinion, I have a high level of confidence that that demonstration scale project, those results, both from a capability aspect as well as an economic aspect, could be scaled up to a large scale project. I don't have that high level of confidence in a pilot scale project. So what I'm trying to state, 100 barrel a day project, I don't know that I have a confidence that that could be moved to a 10,000 barrel a day project. So we may have to stretch that pilot scale a little bit.
Okay, but you're giving us some initial guardrails to think about, and I think that that's fine. So I think you've answered that question. I think that addresses some of the disconnect we have within the different consortiums in the different states as to what's a pilot, what's lab, what's a demonstration, what's a bench scale. I think that would help. So thank you for your discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Davis, do you have questions?
Hello, Mr. McCurdy.
Good
I'm-
afternoon.
I'm Tim Davis. I represent Wild Earth Guardians. I wanted to thank you for your description of the trade secret process related to safety data sheets. I've got a few follow-up questions about that. You testified earlier that any member of the public could have access to the safety data sheets. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you also testified that there is a trade secret exemption related to the OSHA regs at 29 CFR 1200, sorry, 1910.1200.
And Mr.
Correct?
Yes.
Mr. Davis, you're a little loud.
Sorry. I'll try and find the right zone here. I just want to ask if it's your understanding that when a trade secret is claimed for purposes of a safety data sheet, that means that there is no unique chemical identifier for that trade secret chemical that would be disclosed on the SDS.
Oftentimes that is the case because that can vary because some of those chemical identifiers, commonly referred to as CAS numbers, those cover groups of chemicals at times. And so I've seen instances where a trade secret has been claimed, the CAS number has been listed. But if it is a unique chemical with its own unique CAS number, they will remove both of them as a trade secret.
So just to be clear,
Yep.
there is no requirement that. Can you hear me? Did I just cut off? It appears that I was not effective at solving the problem myself. Sorry, right here, right here. Okay. Don't move.
I commiserate with you.
Yeah. Let me start over. Just to be clear, there is no requirement under these OSHA regulations that a trade secret chemical is disclosed with a CAS number, which is a unique chemical identifier. Is that correct?
But again, there are occasions where those unique chemical identifier numbers are defined to a particular group of chemicals. That there can be more than one chemistry that are very similar to one another within that group that cover the same CAS number. So you could have a trade secret and then have a CAS number behind that. But most commonly, if the chemistry is unique, trade secret is claimed and there will be no CAS number listed beside it.
And there's no requirement. The reason it's not listed is because it's not required to be listed if it's truly a trade secret chemical.
It is my understanding, you are correct. It is my understanding that, as I mentioned, when you take those two versions of the SDS to OSHA, if it has a CAS number associated with it, the version that they have that is bare will have that information on there, but will not be required to be on the one that labeled trade secret.
And one last question about that is, therefore, the general public or even regulators with the state of New Mexico will not have access to the CAS number for those trade secret chemicals.
That is correct, with the qualifier that if it does have health information for that product that would pose a danger to the public, that information does have to be on the safety data sheet.
And I wanted to ask you a few more questions about that as well. You mentioned that we're talking about an exception to the trade secret non-disclosure requirement for healthcare providers.
Right.
So a healthcare provider going through a series of steps as outlined in that regulation could obtain the unique chemical identifier, a CAS number, for a trade secret chemical.
Right.
You said that that is also, though, only available to the healthcare provider if they sign an NDA.
That is correct.
Is that a non-disclosure agreement?
Yes.
And so therefore, once that healthcare provider obtains this trade secret information, they can't disclose it to the general public or regulators.
That is correct.
I'm going to move on to another topic. Do you agree that chemicals in frac fluid become constituents of produced water?
Now, I'm not being cagey. Yes and no. Some of the chemicals that are placed into frac water react with the formation and go through a transformation process. The easiest example there is hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid, it's limestone in the formation. It transforms into calcium chloride in water. It is no longer hydrochloric acid once it's spent. However, there are other chemicals that will return back with the produced water and will be in the produced water in their original form.
So it's fair to say that some of the chemicals in a frac fluid will become part of produced water.
Yes.
Do you agree that some constituents of frac fluid are subject to trade secret protections?
My experience has been over the years looking at various frac fluid disclosures, particularly through Frac Focus. You do see instances. I believe I've seen the number quoted in several papers before, somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12% perhaps, or in that general ballpark, that there will be constituents that have a trade secret identifier within that compound.
Therefore, these trade secret chemicals do not have to be disclosed to regulators.
That is correct.
Do you agree that this proposed rule contemplates pilot projects, bench scale projects, industrial projects that would, among other things, characterize produced water that comes from fracked wells?
Yes, and one thing I'd like to reiterate, so a lot of those chemicals that we're talking about that go in with hydraulic fracturing and come out with that flowback water, we're going to have the ability, and as I said, we're getting very close to the point to where there are no unknowns in this treated water. So we will have the ability to know if any of those chemistries have made it through that process.
So I want to turn to your rebuttal testimony at NMOGA 151. The very bottom of the page, I'm looking at lines 19 through 22. This is something that I believe earlier in the day you actually quoted, but I'll wait for you to get there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Earlier in the day feels like a few days ago at this point.
All right, you said 19 through 22?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
So you were asked in this this part of your testimony generally about characterization and some of the challenges, and you were responding to some of the challenges about characterizing produced water that were raised by other parties. Is that fair to say that you were asked about challenges with characterization?
I believe that is correct.
And you responded that there were two possible avenues. And I'm just going to read it. One, lower the salinity of produced water so that it can be analyzed by suitable, approved analytical techniques. Or two, improve instrumentation and techniques so that a highly saline produced water can be accurately analyzed. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you did not suggest simply requiring disclosure of chemicals that are used in frac fluid. Is that correct?
That is something I don't believe I can advocate for, because that's something that consortium I don't believe would have any potential. I don't believe NMOGA would have the potential to push that to existence.
Let me ask you another question that's related. Would you agree that the disclosure of all chemicals used in frac fluid would make it easier to characterize produced water that originates from fracked wells?
So one of the things we have seen in the past, there is at least one of the major pressure pumping suppliers, which are the hydraulic fracturing pressure suppliers. They took a position that they were not going to allow any trade secret claims for any of the flat fluid additives they had. They took the position that they said, here's what we'll do. We'll tell you that we use product A1, B2, C3 up here. And then down here, we'll say of those three products, they all contain these ingredients. None of them are listed as a trade secret. That allows some sort of proprietary information regarding which of those constituents went into which of the 3 products I identified, thus helping prevent one of their competitors from figuring out what they were using in a product. That's primarily what trade secret disclosures are used for, is to where you can keep a competitor from identifying what products you've developed. So do I believe that that helps both the public and regulators understand what's in the fluid as opposed to trade secret? Well, obviously, that would be the case.
So do you agree that disclosure of all chemicals used in a frac fluid would make it easier to characterize the produced water that originates from a fracked well?
So, and I'm not dodging that question. I believe we are seeing improved analytical techniques that are going to help us identify all the chemicals that are in produced water, regardless of knowing what chemistry was used in hydraulic fracturing. Would it make it easier? Perhaps so. If you have approved analytical techniques in a high saline matrix for that particular chemical. Otherwise, we move to a method to where we improve the analytical techniques, as I suggested, or we move that water to a lower TDS standpoint to where there are approved analytical techniques to look for the various chemicals that are in that water.
Let me try something else here. You spoke earlier about targeted and non-targeted testing.
Mhm.
If you don't know the constituents of a sample that you're analyzing, you would use non-targeted testing to try and gain some understanding of what constituents are present in that sample.
So we would use a combination of the two because we do have a good idea of approximately 90% of the constituents that are going to be in that water. So we would use targeted analysis for those where applicable. Non-targeted analysis is predominantly being used to identify those unknown compounds.
You can't use targeted testing for an unknown compound. Is that correct?
I think it's a fair statement.
You can't use non-targeted testing to quantify chemical constituent, correct?
No, I do not believe that is correct. That is the most recent, and I think I use that in my testimony, the most recent research that we have through the New Mexico Consortium identified 12 unknown compounds through non-targeted analysis, or identified that there were 12 yet to be determined, yet quantified each of the 12 at typically part per billion levels in that water.
Let's assume you have a sample of produced water in which you know every unique chemical that was used in the frac fluid. For that sample, you would not need to use non-targeted testing to identify any chemicals that would have been introduced via frac fluid. Is that correct?
I can't say that that is correct because we're having to identify other constituents in that water that may have not been placed in there through the hydraulic fracturing process. There could be organics from the formation that we do not have a firm identification on that we need to identify. Additionally, that there has been research done in the past that when we run frac fluid into a formation, we can see the release of some of the minerals that are in the formation that weren't in the frac fluid when it went in there. Pyrite's one example.
Let me see if I can restate the question. If you know every chemical via a unique chemical identifier, a CAS number, that's in frac fluid, for each of those chemicals, if you want to test their presence in a treated produced water that comes from that source sample, you use targeted testing.
So yes, if when you word it like that, if I knew every single chemical that would be in there and I wanted to determine the concentration of those chemicals in that water, then I would use targeted analysis for those chemicals.
If you have a different sample in which you do not know the CAS number for each chemical constituent in the frac fluid, to characterize that water, you're going to need to use non-targeted testing.
So once again, and I promise you, I'm not trying to be argumentative. In both instances, we would employ non-targeted analysis as well. Non-targeted analysis is used to identify unknown substances that are in the water. There are potentially other unknowns other than the trade secret chemicals that were placed into the water. So even if I knew 100% disclosure of all the chemicals that were placed into the water, I would still deploy non-targeted analysis as part of the analysis process to ensure there were not any unknowns in there that I was not known. In both instances, I would employ both targeted and non-targeted analysis.
And maybe the fault is mine through the wording of my question, but I just want to make clear that I'm inquiring into characterizing the produced water for purposes of finding those chemicals that were in the frac fluid.
Yes, sir.
So in that instance, if you know what's in the frac fluid, you can use targeted testing. If you don't know what's in the frac fluid, you have to use non-targeted testing.
Yes. So allow me to reword that, and you see if you agree with how I'm interpreting it. If I know every constituent that was put into that water and I'm wanting to identify those constituents, I could do that just through targeted analysis. Setting those constituents aside and looking at a separate water that had some components that had a trade secret and did not have a unique chemical identifier, I would have to use both targeted and non-targeted analysis to help identify those compounds. Is that a fair way of how you're?
Based on the statement you just made, would you agree that the disclosure of all trade secret chemicals, all chemicals used in a frac fluid, would remove a layer of complexity to the characterization process of produced water coming from a fracked well?
It should. All right. Not again, not to be cagey, but you're absolutely correct. If we have trade secret claims with we do not have unique chemical identifiers with those products, that adds a layer of complexity to determine what could potentially be in that water.
And I have one final question. Are you aware that the state of Colorado has passed legislation that requires the disclosure of all chemicals that are used downhole? Yep. Thank you, Mr. McCurdy. Madam Hearing Officer, I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, sir.
So we should take just a 10-minute break, because otherwise we will go too long if we try to hit the 5:30 mark. So let's just take 10 minutes, come back at 4:35. Ms. Nasi?
Good afternoon, ma'am.
And I appreciate your in-depth knowledge specifically of the requirements from Texas. So I'd like to talk to you in detail about that, okay?
All right.
So is it your understanding that pilot projects in Texas, first and foremost, require a permit for pilot projects?
Yes, with understanding that they're not really referring to it as a permit. The Railroad Commission is currently referring to it as a letter of authorization, but essentially it is a permit.
And that's because it requires notice.
Mhm.
Could you, I just noticed something before when you were talking to Mr. Davis. It's really important for the record if you could say yes or no, whatever your answer is, instead of even yup.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. So even though it's called a different thing, you know what a permit requires. One is notice, right?
Yes, ma'am.
The other is specifically in Texas, they require notice to all surrounding landowners, correct?
For a land application or for a surface discharge?
For
And by surface discharge, ma'am, I mean to a waterway or a stream bed.
I don't know that what I'm looking at. It just says before you can get an authorization to conduct a pilot study. These are the requirements that it says. So I'm not sure if it distinguishes actually.
Okay. If I can say this, and that may be why they're referring to these as letters of authorization instead of a permit. I've read through the requirements for a letter of authorization. I do not see requirements in there for a like public comment period, or typically these pilots are small in nature. So they're generally the landowner is going to be inclusive all the way around the pilot itself. And it will be the landowner that is requesting the letter of authorization.
And do you think that it is consistent with public health and the environment to require, if a permit is required, that specifically all the surrounding landowners are notified?
If that is what is required for a permit, and I'm not arguing with you that it is, then yes, that would be required. If these letter of authorizations are conducted in such a way that it is the landowner and he owns the land all around the pilot project, he has been notified.
And there's limits in scale, limits on location and gallons per day, correct?
That is correct.
There's also a technical review of each application. Is that correct?
That is, are we referring to permits now or letters of authorization?
This just is talking about authorization to conduct a public study, a pilot study.
Is this under the Railroad Commission?
It is, sir.
Okay.
So, do you believe that a technical review of each application would be warranted in New Mexico?
Yes.
In addition to a public meeting on each permit application, do you believe that what should be required in New Mexico is that all information regarding the application and the technical review and the determination be provided online? So in our case, it would be on the NMED's website.
I would agree with that. I believe that, as I said, I do not believe the Railroad Commission's letter of authorization requires a public comment period, but it is my understanding that the technical review, the data from the technical review will be available to the public through the Railroad Commission.
And you would agree that that would be appropriate in New Mexico?
Yes, ma'am, I would.
And the other thing is that the application and all the information is available in both English and Spanish.
I think that would be fair considering where we are geographically in the U.S.
And you would agree that that should happen in New Mexico as well?
Yes, I would.
Now, there's required specific information regarding oil and grease.
Yep.
Yeah, oil and grease, chlorides, sulfites, dissolved materials, petroleum, hydrocarbons, and norm. Those are required to be disclosed.
I believe that is correct, and it is my understanding that the technical evaluation is going to involve a much larger list of constituents than just those.
And would you agree that if this commission should adopt a standards for a pilot project, that at least all of those things should be required to be disclosed?
Yes, I would.
Do you agree that if there was a pilot project in New Mexico, and basically, if you could allow me to not have to repeat that for every single thing that I'm going to go through, but
Okay.
I would like you to assume that.
Yes,
please.
right now we're talking about pilot projects in New Mexico.
Correct.
Yes.
And can I just dispense with that first phrase, but you understand, right?
Yes.
That I'm asking you about. If this commission were to allow permit process for pilot projects, that these following things that I'm going to ask you about should be required in New Mexico. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Require full disclosure about how the applicant would propose to dispose of all the residual concentrated waste.
From the pilot project.
Correct.
Yes.
Characterize the source fluids with specificity, including levels.
Please allow me, I'm just trying to be sure that I clearly understand. The source fluids mean the water that was intended to be applied as part of the pilot project.
The produced water that was intended to be.
That is currently required under the Texas process as well.
And you would agree that that
Yes.
would be fair to include here?
Yes.
A schematic of the treatment process.
Yes, I believe that would be fair.
In New Mexico.
Yep.
Characterization of the treated fluids and their consistency in quality, meaning all levels of constituents other than H2O.
I believe that would be fair. If I can clarify that, as I've stated earlier, we have developed lists. The New Mexico Consortium has what they refer to as their NPDES plus list, which is an extensive list. If we could limit it to that list, that would be great, because otherwise we're expanding to unknown processes that I would not know how to comply with.
Where is that list?
That exists. You can get that through the New Mexico Produced Water Resource Consortium. It is referred to again as their NPDES plus list of constituents.
And you think that that's on their website?
It should be, or if not, you should be able to reach out to them for that. I believe that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 different constituents or analysis.
So you think that those 400 constituents that that the consortium has listed in the NPDES plus
Yes.
Should be required to be disclosed to NMED?
Yes.
And that is in terms of not only the fluids themselves, but all levels of constituents, correct?
That is correct. So that would be both. Now, when you say not only the fluids, what other constituents would we analyze for that list? It would have to be a liquid.
Sir, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm just reading what it says on the Railroad Commission's site. And it says, characterize the treated fluids and their constituency in quality. And then it says, parentheses, levels of constituents other than H2O.
Okay. So if you allow me to say that I would agree that that list should be analyzed for the raw incoming water, as well as the water that was intended to be applied via the pilot, I would agree to that statement.
And sir, just to be specific, you're talking about produced water, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Identify the constituents of concern.
Oh, I understand. That's where we're going here. So that would be up to NMED out of that particular list of constituents. Obviously, there's a lot of things in there to be concerned about. I would say there was a ranking. It's one constituent may not be as concernable as one over here that's extremely hazardous. So I would allow NMED to go with particular notice. We want to know these levels here.
A description, a full comprehensive description of the reuse scenario.
I think that's fair, yes.
A comprehensive description of the water treatment methodologies, in parentheses, i.e. modalities, and how they will directly affect the reuse scenario.
I think that's fair.
And, you know, you were talking with a couple of other attorneys before, and I think that what you said is that in the pilot projects, you would favor full disclosure of constituents, but that the methodologies, the exact way, the instrumentalities, I'll call it, that still be allowed to be not disclosed.
So if you allow me, I would advocate that the general description of that be allowed. Like I could come to you and say, this is a thermal treatment process that is going to recover a clean water vapor from this produced water without going into it's going to have multi-stage eductors, size, this size and all. That would be intellectual property, but I could give, our industry could give a general description of exactly what's going to occur in that treatment process. Right.
Now, what I noticed further on the Texas Railroad Commission site is that at any point, first of all, NMED for us would be able to deny an application. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And also that the NMED, like the Railroad Commission, could ask for further information,
Yes.
could require limits on some parts of the application and allow the others,
Yes.
could modify the request for a pilot project or the permit for a pilot project on any legitimate basis within the scope of these lists of things that we're discussing.
I believe that would be fair, as long as the regulatory body felt they had a declarative need, a scientific need, that we have a concern from this standpoint. We're not going to allow this. We have a concern until you can demonstrate that it can meet a limit. I would agree to that statement.
Back to the list itself. List any process and or treatment chemicals used at the facility that may be present in the produced water to be land applied. Include an estimate of the concentrations that may occur in the produced water to be land applied. Include material safety data sheets for each chemical.
They need to update their website. We don't call them MSDS any longer. And to be clear, they're not referencing any chemicals that may be in that water coming in. They're specifying what have you added during this treatment process. You need to disclose that. And if I understand that regulation correctly, yes, you do have to supply the safety data sheet with it, but there's nothing in that wording about trade secret information. You don't have to go into constituents. You have to disclose, we used hydrogen peroxide on the front end to oxidize and remove iron.
For instance,
we had to use a certain chemistry as a flocculant to remove solids from the water prior to it going into this desal. That is information that they're going to want to disclose in that permit, along with the name of the product, safety data sheet with it, what was the concentration used in the treatment process.
provide a representative water quality analysis of the produced water and the treated produced water.
Yes.
Provide soil sampling in the application area to establish background soil chemistry to support viability of the present soil to support crop growth. Soil analysis should include sodium absorption ratios, soil pH, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium.
And I apologize. I was going to wait till the end to say yes, that I would agree with that rather than respond to each one of them.
Thank you. So what I want to say is that provision is basically to keep your company or oil and gas honest, right? Because you got to do a pre-soil analysis to determine what the constituents in that soil are, for instance, so that if it's all contaminated after, they can't say it was that way from that way before.
And I advocate that on many of the pilot projects, not only just in this space, but when I'm looking at perhaps a new chemical application in a hydraulic fracturing, I want to know the results prior to us adding that, to where I'll know, did it get better? Did it get worse? Right? So yes, background samples need to be taken to where we know what starting point we're at.
Provide an application rate in barrels of the treated produced water that is irrigating the crop.
Yes, I believe that should be done.
Identify constraints associated with the proposed reuse activity.
So an example of that would be if you identify some sort of elevation change on that particular plot of land, then it may be necessary to put a berm on the lower side of that property. So in the event of a rainfall, we do not see runoff from that pilot project.
And then there's a whole slew of administrative considerations as well that are included. So you have referred to some of them. One is that the pilot study permit is only good for 1 year.
So that is correct. There is a provision within the LOA that it can be extended for an additional year.
Yes. If the activity is in good standing.
Yes.
And there's also quarterly, there's also quarterly monitoring. And again, the analyses have to be tendered to the NMED, and the NMED would have to disclose that in real time on their website.
Yes, and it is my understanding, and I would expect New Mexico to do the same thing. I believe Texas, I think I heard the description earlier today. For land sampling, they use what's referred to as a 5-spot. We have samples in each corner of the plot as well as one is in the center. That's also what you do once a quarter, as well as this chemical analysis of the raw and treated produced water once a quarter. I would expect the same here.
And sir, there's also a financial security.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if you could elaborate about that.
So that is caused some interesting discussions. Typically, when we look at financial security, we're talking to oil and gas companies that have generally deep pockets, or at least we like to believe they do. With these LOA processes and the letter of authority being issued to the landowner, then the landowner has to get assistance with getting that financial assurity. Typically, that's done through the technology provider he's working with or the operator that's supplying the water for the project.
Yeah, so if the applicant wasn't a landowner here,
Yep.
But was someone like yourself,
Yep.
Select Water Solutions, and because you applied for an RFI, right?
Yep.
That's a yes, right?
Or, excuse me, we submitted information for the RFI. That wasn't an application process. It was a information gathering tool. But yes, we did reply response to that.
And not only Select Water Solutions, but you yourself are the person.
I was the lead point for that project. Yes.
Okay. So let's say Select Water Solutions was applying
Yep.
for a permit.
Sorry. Yes.
Thank you. Was applying for a permit. Select Water Solutions would have to give some kind of financial security, and maybe that's for NMED to discern the specific details, but financial security is definitely one of those things that should be included.
Yes, let me agree with that completely. Part of the image that this industry has faced from the past have been typically smaller companies that have walked away from projects and left cleanups to the states to consider. And if the financial securities they're not there to provide for that cleanup cost, then it's a cost of the state. And I'm not in favor of that. If, first of all, we intend to do no harm, but if we do harm, then it's up to us to clean it up.
And so we talked about quarterly and a final report at the end, correct?
That is correct. And there are certain time limits associated with all that within this certain period, you have to have that report back in.
Inspections.
Yep.
So that would also be a commitment on behalf of NMED to this body that they would in fact perform those inspections and then tender that information back to the Water Quality Commission. Is that also correct?
I believe that is correct as well.
In Texas, the pilot projects go right to the equivalent of our Water Quality Commission, the Railroad Commission, and there's no sort of in-between agency like the NMED, right?
So under the current guidelines now, that information goes straight back to the Railroad Commission. Not sure if there may be a division within the Railroad Commission that information would go to for review. I know the people that we're currently working with within the Railroad Commission that are kind of construing all this and working up the guidelines. At present, with this being an NMED process and the Water Quality Control Commission falling underneath the NMED, correct? Not under OCD. So that's the difference in Texas. Those projects are going to be handled by the oil regulator, whereas here they will be regulated by the environmental. At some point in the future, once we get past, if we get past that pilot phase for land application, there is a possibility that PCEQ could become involved with those larger applications. That is at least my understanding of the discussions between those two regulatory bodies.
And I think that the last thing that is required, and I would hope that you would also agree is necessary for a pilot project here, is the certification under oath by an individual, that an individual is responsible vis-a-vis whatever entity that applied for the permit.
I have no problem with that. I'm fully in favor of accountability. That's why projects such as I'm lost the acronym now, but some projects within the state require certification by a professional engineer.
Okay, so on to a different topic.
Madam Hearing Officer, is it possible to get a clarification here? Because from my reading, the Texas system, it's an actual permit, but it's not clear if the questions are regarding permitting with NMED or the NOI process, which is what's in the rules.
All right. So I think the witness was speaking to the letter of authorization that's offered in Texas.
That is correct.
Right. Like, Ms. Nanasi is asking, she's consistently saying permits and relating to NMED, so it's not clear to me which she's referring
Oh, I
to.
see. Okay. So you want to pursue the clarification from Ms. Nanasi?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll do it with the witness, right? That's how.
If you can just answer the commissioner's question, are you, when you're asking him about the Texas letter of authorization system, are you comparing it or contrasting it or relating it to?
So she's asking if it would apply to what NMED's proposing, I think, which would be the NOI, but she's using the word permitting, which is not on the table right now.
I see. Okay.
My answer to you, and then I'll ask the witness, is we don't believe that the notice of intent is legal. That's what our position is. And so our position is that a pilot project requires by law under 7013-4D a permit. And so that's my answer to you. My question to you is, sir, if anything that I asked you was unclear, I'm asking you about all those requirements that I just asked you about individually and listed basically in my questions. I'm asking you, should those be requirements under a permit for a pilot project in New Mexico?
So allow me to answer this way, and then you can correct me or we can clarify. If all the requirements that we just walked through differ in any significant way than what's under the current NOI process that's been proposed, then they would have to be considered as a separate process. Is that a fair statement or is that a fair answer?
What I'm saying is New Energy Economy's position is that the NOI process is illegal, unlawful, and that the reuse in any way of produced water off the oil field under 70-13-4D requires a permit. So I'm talking about New Energy Economy's rule, not NMED's rule. So what I just asked you, all those things.
Yep.
Do you believe those requirements are necessary for a permit process for pilot projects?
So I'm not trying to be cagey. I'm trying to be sure I use my words correctly. Regardless of how it's identified, I believe a pilot project that was going to utilize water, treated water outside of oil and gas operations should have those requirements.
Thank you so much. In NMOGA Exhibit 7, your resume, it states that you serve on the Technical Steering Committee for the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium.
Yes, ma'am.
Were you aware of an independent audit that is part of the record in this case as NG, that's Norm Gom, 14, of an independent audit of the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium that was finalized in December 2022?
Okay. Yes and no. I was aware that the audit was conducted. I was one of 6 members of industry involved with the consortium that was interviewed by the 3 auditing individuals from NMSU, I believe. However, I have yet to see a final of that audit available. I have requested to see a copy of that audit, and it has never been provided.
Would you be surprised to know that, well, it's in the record, so you can ask your counsel to see it. But would you be surprised to know that that independent audit recommended that the Technical Steering Committee be eliminated?
Essentially, I have no problem with that. We have, outside of having a meeting initially when we were setting this thing up, that is not an ongoing working group.
Would you agree with this statement that the purpose of treating produced water is to sell the water for reuse and save on disposal costs from injection wells?
The purpose, I would not agree with that. Okay. What I would state is the treatment and use of oil and gas water or produced water outside of oil and gas is to reduce the volume that is going to disposal, because we have disposal volumes that are beginning to cause us issues. And in order to continue growth of oil and gas opportunities within the state of New Mexico, we're going to have to resolve those disposal issues that produced water. Ultimately, this will not be a money-making endeavor for the oil and gas industry. It will likely be an additional cost to the oil and gas industry, because as much as I would like to see it happen, I don't believe the ultimate treatment and recovery of this water is going to be as cheap as how we dispose of water today. Now, it may be as cheap as how we will have to pay to dispose of water 5 years from now, but not today. But the industry is fully aware, without additional avenues, that we will likely see some form of curtailment in oil and gas activities going forward. I've made this statement before. If we were in a situation to where we did not have an outlet through hydraulic fracturing for use of a lot of this water, we would start putting some hard brakes on continued development right now, because we would not have an avenue for this water to go through. Excuse me.
Do you believe that the reuse of treated produced water helps limit the need to use fresh water for fracking?
Absolutely.
Is it your position that investment into recycling and treatment projects is a way to reduce the amount of fresh water needed for new wells while reducing the volume of produced water needed to be managed?
Yes, I think that's a fair statement.
Would you agree that Select Water Solutions is a service company in the oil and gas industry that specializes in water solutions?
Well, it's in the name, But yes, ma'am, I would say that I will make a statement, and this is a factual statement, that currently of all the midstream water companies, Select Water Solution is the largest recycler of produced water in the U.S.
And half of your profits come from the Permian Basin. Is that correct?
I would think that I'm not one of our financial or part of the Treasury Department, but I believe just looking at it, that would be correct.
Madam Hearing Examiner, may I approach?
Yes.
Madam Hearing Examiner, for the record, this has been uploaded to Dropbox as New Energy Economy Exhibit 34. And Ms. Jones, may I ask, would you please, just for the record, this is the master's project proposal submitted by Carly Osborne to Dr. Avner Van Gogh, was cited in his May 6th rebuttal testimony that is cited throughout his testimony, including a link, and he testified about it. And so I wanted to talk to you about this report. Okay. And I wanted to ask you if you would read, if you could go, Ms. Jones, please, to the second page where it's highlighted. And so let me just ask you something before I continue. You started to work at Select Water Solutions in November 2021, correct?
That is correct.
And so, you know, though, that Select Energy Services was the name of Select Water Solutions up until about a year and a half or so ago.
June of last year.
Okay. So if you don't mind, could you please read into the record the highlighted portion before you on page 2 and then 3?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
This master project investigates the water quality of produced waters generated from the unconventional oil exploration in the Permian Basin and the treated water generated from a treatment site. As part of this study, 15 water samples were collected at the Chiltepin recycling plant in Pecos, Texas, prior and after treatment that involved temporary storage of the oil wastewater in open reservoir that is managed with a continuous treatment of aeration to the pit. Water samples were analyzed at Van Gogh Lab in Duke University for major elements and dissolved organic carbon, DOC. The data show that the Permian produced water is highly saline, fluoride up to 27,000 milligrams per liter, 1.4 times the salinity of seawater, with high concentrations of ammonium, boron, excuse me, would you like me to read the numbers that they have there?
If you could, please.
Okay, stepping back to ammonium, 175 milligrams per liter, boron, 50 milligrams per liter, and DOC, 220 milligrams per liter. This water quality infers that disposal or leaking of the Permian wastewater to the environment would cause major damage to the ecological system and contamination of water resources. The data show that the water quality of the treated water is indistinguishable and that untreated than that of untreated, and thus the recycling process in the site does not reduce the salts and contaminants potential of the Permian produced water.
And then, sir, would you, and Ms. Jones, could we go please to the next page? And I would just like you to read the last highlighted portion, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Can I just, I mean, you might short circuit everything. Typically you can't just read stuff into the record unless it's admitted. We actually don't have an objection to this simply being admitted. It was significantly discussed yesterday by Dr. Vengosh, and probably it's helpful for the commission to just see the paper.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually, particularly after the readings yesterday from the book. I mean, I didn't even hear a question from you following his reading of that first lengthy passage, like, do you agree with it, for example? So is there any reason not to offer this for admission?
First of all, thank you to Mr. Wexler for having no objection to New Energy Economy Exhibit 34. I would like to read this last one, and then I will ask some questions to follow up on that. And that's the only thing else that I'd like to read into the record.
Okay. Good. Yeah.
May I ask a question? Dr. Vengosh's testimony refers to a master's thesis. This document is a master's project proposal, or is it, the chair should know better than I about what the difference is. If there is a difference, I don't know. Is this the same document as Dr. Vengosh was referring to?
This document is the same document that was in a web address in his testimony, in his direct testimony. But it is not a thesis. A thesis represents a piece of completed work that has been presented typically to a committee and approved. This is a proposal. Not clear that it's been approved by any faculty or committee at Duke.
Go ahead, Ms. Zanassi.
Would you, sir, please indulge us and just read that last paragraph on page 4?
Yes, ma'am. The plant was constructed to treat produced water for reuse for new hydraulically fractured wells, as it can be sold at a lower price than fresh water and save on disposal costs. It is with this intention that the technology is vetted, but not clear conclusion of treatment capability can be determined without testing samples with potential methods identified. In this project, the primary evaluation for treatment was to determine the change in composition of the treated produced water. Currently, the recycling plant is not operated.
And sir, you are familiar with this Chiltepin plant?
So this Chiltepin plant is not operational. It has not been operational since my time at Select.
But you are aware of it?
And can I say that yes, along the lines of I'm aware of the 16 plus recycling facilities we have in the Permian in operation right now that do the same sort of treatment that this plant did.
And but this Chiltepin plant is no longer in operation, correct?
It is not it has not been since I've been here.
Okay. And there's no disputing that Select Energy Services is the precursor to Select Water Solutions.
So to clarify that, through bolt-on acquisitions over a several-year period, Select Energy Services had approximately 12 different subsidiary companies, all maintaining their own identity and name and ways of invoicing and ways of doing this, which was becoming a nightmare. Last year, the decision was made to consolidate everything under one company name. Thus, it is now Select Water Solutions. And under that, I say consolidate everything. You have Select Water, Select Chemistry, because we have a chemistry division. And then we have a rental division that they held out separately because it's not related to water, that's referred to as Peak Oilfield Rentals. But yes, it is the same company.
And you understand that this master's student tested the produced water that went into this facility and tested the post treatment.
So this is where we need to start making distinctions, because we're talking exclusively in here about treated produced water as being potentially applied. This is not that water. This facility was never intended to produce that. This facility, and you look at the results of their analysis, is doing exactly what this facility was intended to do, because this water is going to be used in ongoing hydraulic fracturing completions, not released outside oil and gas operations.
But the fact is that post-treatment, the chemicals that were identified and discussed in this report, there was no scientific analytical difference between the produced water that went into, maybe call it feed water, and then the treated produced water. Is that correct?
Yes. Would you allow me to explain what we try to remove in these facilities? There are essentially 3 compounds that can affect hydraulic fracturing chemicals that are used in operations. That is dissolved iron in the water, suspended solids in the water, and dispersible hydrocarbons in the water. So these facilities are designed on the front end to be treated with an oxidizer, most commonly either hydrogen peroxide or ozone. That oxidizes the iron molecules. They then go through a chemical flocculation, coagulation, and flocculation process, which brings all these suspended solids and iron particles and dispersible hydrocarbons together. They then go through a process that's referred to as dissolved air flotation. Dissolved air lifts all these contaminants up to the top, where they are paddled and skimmed off to where they are treated and be prepared to go to a disposal. That is all that is removed from this produced water. None of the salts, minerals, or metals outside of iron are removed in this treatment process.
Mrs. Nasi, would you come to a good stopping point?
Good stop now.
All righty. We will adjourn for the day then, begin at 9 in the morning with any public comment there is to be given, and complete your questioning after that. Thank you.